So the second of our pieces of the puzzle in terms of wildlife management is the habitat. And so we've got 4 basic habitat principles. Hopefully we're pretty comfortable with the 4th one there, succession, because it's something we've talked about, but let's add in 3 other parts. So we're going to add in interspersion, which is the spatial arrangement of habitats across a landscape. We're going to add in the idea of edge and ecotone, which is the idea of multiple ecosystems coming together and the areas that end up in between those, where it's very good for early successional species, but bad for interior species. We're going to also talk about vertical and horizontal arrangement within a habitat. And we're going to focus on the vertical part of it, but we'll talk about both. And then the idea of succession is our 4th habitat principle. So in terms of interspersion, and we'll throw out the term juxtaposition there as well, the idea of the spatial relationships of different habitat types. So when you look here at the figure provided, you'll see in A there's per interspersion. So you see that there's the one covey, and you've got it's got part of the woods and part where it's cultivated land and part where it's brush and part where it's grass. But then you see on the right here good interspersion, where you see that the coveys are all over the place, and the coveys have a mixture of different things. Sometimes it's the cultivation and a little bit of woods and a little bit of grass and a little bit of brush. Sometimes it's you've got the water in there. Sometimes it's a mixture of all of them. It's the idea that that you're being able to take advantage of all the different habitats that are there, and being able to use all the different parts that are available to you. It's a important thing for wildlife that that different habitat types are available, because different habitat types offer different things. So sometimes a food source would be located in one, but a cover, the area that they use for cover would be located in another, and the area that they use to mate or use to reproduce or nest in might be located in another. So if you've got all of these on offer and it's not the same thing over and over again, that works out well for the species. Our second principle is the idea of edge and ecotone. So edge would be the contact zone between 2 different types of habitat, and the ecotone is the transition zone between 2 diverse communities. So in the example that we see here, we see our terrestrial ecosystem and we see our aquatic ecosystem. So then we have our ecotone in between, and we have a bunch of edge species that live there. So you get this species-rich zone where you'll get more species there, you get more plant life, because you're kind of getting the benefits of both areas rather than just one or the other. Because you're this transitional zone, you get both the good things that come with the land and the good things that come with the aquatic system. So it's a very useful place for a lot of species, and a lot of that just comes down to our basic ecological principles. So these edge areas are very good in terms of having photosynthetic capability. So you get a lot of producers, and if you get a lot of producers, that's going to bring on a bunch of consumers. And so there's just going down to the basics of ecology kind of tells us why edge and ecotone would be important. So here's another example. So we can see we have our land and we have our aquatic, and we can see how some of those species from each of the areas will overlap in the ecotone, as well as being in one or the other. They won't all obviously go all the way over, like a duck is going to stay in the ecotone or the aquatic zone, but not really go to the land zone. Whereas also the snake is going to stay in the land zone in the ecotone, but not really make its way over to the aquatic zone. So, but because of what's available in terms of the amount of species and the producers available for consumers, the food chain, there's so many opportunities for niches to be filled in these transition zones. The idea of edge and ecotone are really important in terms of wildlife management. Our third principle had to do with the idea of vertical and horizontal arrangement. So when we think about the idea of vertical arrangement, we want to think about the idea of forest and the idea of canopy, midstory, and ground cover. So we've got these different layers in the forest, and the different layers can function for different species. Certainly the canopy layer up above the ground, that's going to be much more focused on like bird species, but you also get squirrels and other small mammals who might be having their nesting areas up above because they're trying to escape predators down on the ground and in the shrub layers, or even depending on how big your midstory is, that might be a lot of the cover that's being used for larger mammals like deer and elk, areas that they'll be bedding down in. When you get down to the really low ground cover, things like mice and small, really tiny mammals that we don't even see because they're so small, they're able to use that ground cover to keep themselves hidden. So it's all these different pieces of the arrangement of the forest can serve a different role depending on the species of wildlife. Now, when we talk about the idea of horizontal arrangement, it's the idea of this continuous amount of forest cover or ecosystem coverage. So when we look at this picture here, the idea that you got the trees, and then the trees are connected to the shrubs, and you've got grass growing along the bottom there, and then you get to the fields, and the fields connect to the reeds, and then maybe they connect to some sort of water. And so you've got this idea of coverage throughout this whole thing. So if you're a small mammal or something that needs a water source, but then also wants to bed down in the forest, you can be covered and maybe safe from the predatory hawks and whatnot above if you've got enough coverage below. But it really just depends on the situation. And that's where earlier we talked about the idea of fragmentation, how fragmentation could be difficult for animals in terms of reproduction and just disrupting the ecosystem. So imagine now if in the middle of this figure that we had, there's just an agricultural field with nothing on it, a bare agricultural field or a farm. And then all of a sudden now these animals have to figure out how to go from the forest to the reeds area and the water, but they know that they're going to be out and exposed in this one part, and it would really change completely the way that they would act. So horizontal arrangement is just as important as vertical arrangement. And then forest succession, hopefully we've talked about that enough earlier. If you need to rethink about that idea, remember we talked about that before in ecological principles, so look back at those notes. But just quickly going over forest succession, the idea that there's this predictable pattern that the ecosystem goes through. So in this case, we're starting off with plants. Plants would lead to shrubs. Shrubs would lead to a young forest, then a mature forest, and then a climax forest. And the only thing that's going to change this is if there's some sort of disturbance that will knock succession back to an earlier stage. In terms of dealing with people, to me, and maybe it's just because of the position I have, but I actually think dealing with people is the hardest part of this whole thing. I mean, wildlife are you know, they're not they're animals, but they're predictable, and the habitat is something in terms of wildlife management that we can understand the basics of and then start to manipulate. But people are hard because people can make up their own decisions, and people, if you try and force somebody to do something, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen. And so one of the biggest ways that we can influence people and get them to follow along or follow the herd is to enact policies and laws, whether those are local, state, federal, or even global laws, in terms of trying to get them to understand that certain things are okay and certain things aren't okay. And I've posed the question here, why do we have to enact laws to protect unowned resources? And the thing is that when we saw what happened in the past, and we've talked about it before in this class, when there weren't laws in place and what people would do. And so it's not that every person is a problem, but the thing is, if we understand our role in the ecosystem, and we understand the type of life that we want to have, and then we see the wildlife, and we understand ecosystem, and we understand these basic ecological principles, we've got to start saying, okay, I get what the wildlife needs, I get what the forest needs, I get what the aquatic ecosystem needs, I get what the soil needs, and I see what I want as a human being. Now let's find a way to make it all work. Let's find a way to put it all together, because we should be able to do that. And if we can't if what we've got to do is put laws in, then we've got to put laws in to really get people to understand that, because not everybody can see that whole picture. And I'm hoping by you taking this class and by you watching these lectures and going through all this work, that you become one of those people who can see the whole picture. Going into the idea of the laws. So one of the big things that we put forth is the idea of hunting regulations. So seasonal limits, bag limits, gear restrictions. On the right here, this picture of Alabama. So they not only have different zones that you have to stay in, but then certain times that you can be in those zones. And then they have, it says gobblers only. So you can only take like a male or female. In this case, that would be male. Or they have some youth hunts or disabled hunts. So they have all these special restrictions in place because we want to make sure that the population stays sustainable. And one of the big things with people is that everybody has this opportunity to hunt in North America, because it's been part of our tradition, part of the idea of people who settled this land, was that they lived off of this land. And I don't think people want to lose that, and I don't think that they should have to lose that. I think it's an important part of the relationship between people and wildlife, and people really understanding how they can fit into the ecosystem, or the role that they can have into the ecosystem. But laws definitely need to be in place in order to show people how to deal with this, and how to see themselves as part of the ecosystem and not just the apex predator of the ecosystem. Another way in terms of the idea of enacting laws is to regulate activities and land use. So coming up with zoning laws, coming up with agricultural laws and how they relate to the ecosystem. In forestry, we have things called BMPs and SMZs. So in forestry, we have best management practices. So how are we going to conduct forestry operations, but also thinking about the wildlife and the habitat, and how those forestry activities will affect the habitat. And then an SMZ is a streamside management zone. And why that's important is the idea that we recognize how important water is in the whole ecosystem. We need it, the animals need it, the soil needs it, everything on this planet runs off of the water. And so streamside management zones have been set as special areas in forestry where they have their own rules that are a little more restrictive, because we want to make sure that those areas, especially those areas, are being taken care of. And also the idea of recreation. People like to go out on the land, they like to recreate, they like to use the land, but we want to make sure that they're doing it in a way that they are not causing any problems with how they use the land. There's nothing wrong with people wanting to use the land, wanting to be out in the ecosystem, wanting to enjoy nature. as long as they understand that their enjoyment of nature shouldn't come at the sacrifice of nature. And that's where the last part of the people principles really comes in, but truly, to me, the most important part of the people principles, and that's the idea that you've got to educate the people. It's what I'm hopefully doing here for you guys. It's what I'm hoping that you will then do to the people that you know, is to take the information that you know and the information that you understand about ecosystems and natural resources and how all of this ties together, and then take that knowledge and tell other people about it, and kind of in a positive pyramid scheme, work our way out to where everybody becomes educated on these principles. And so when they're dealing with wildlife, it doesn't become a shock, or it doesn't become something where they say, well, how could this be? Or I don't understand this. If people have these basic understandings, if they're educated about what to do with wildlife and how everything that they do affects the ecosystem, then it doesn't become as problematic. It's not something that becomes hard to deal with. One of the things I've been saying lately is that every decision is simple. It's whether it's easy or hard is a matter of time. And how that applies to this is that a lot of these decisions, when it comes to the ecosystem, when it comes to dealing with wildlife, they're really simple decisions, because there's a right way to do it and there's a bunch of wrong ways to do it. But because we have to do it now, or this is when the money's available, or we need to do it while this guy's president but not this guy, or there's a surplus in the budget this year, so let's figure out something to do. It's all these reasons that force decision making. But really, there's a right way to do things and there's wrong ways to do things, and we just need to educate people and get them to understand what the right ways are. And the more right ways people know how to do things, the easier it's going to be to get things done. And that's the important part when it comes to this three-legged stool model, is the idea that we want to get things done. We want to make sure that the wildlife is protected, but also that we're meeting our goals. And so bringing it all together, the idea of humans, the idea of animals, and the idea of habitat. So I said at the beginning, we were starting with that simple three-legged stool model. We are still in the three-legged stool model here, but there is a lot that goes into it. So this is a much more complex model, but still the same basic idea. But when we're talking about the human dimension of this thing, we're talking about government, we're talking about communication, we're talking about laws, we're talking about economics, we're talking about policies, we're talking about sociology. With the animals, we're talking about their life histories, their genetics, their ecologies, the principles of wildlife management, zoology, mammalogy, herpetology, ornithology. With the habitat, we're talking about plant ecology, range management, forestry, succession, plant physiology, plant morphology, landscape ecology. All of these different things being brought together and having to be considered and thought about at all points. And I think what really natural resources comes down to is the idea that it just seems complex because there's so many moving parts to it. But there is simplicity to it if we are educated and if we understand the problem and we can see how all of these things are connected. And so let's kind of break it back down and let's go back to simplistic, and let's set some simplistic steps to wildlife management. The first one is to set our human-based goals, because we said with our definition that's the art and science of how we deal with habitat, humans, and animals to then meet our human goals. So we have to set some sort of human-based goals, whether that's our huntable population, or we really want ecosystem integrity and sustainability, or we want to be able to have crop production but not have economic problems with our crop production, whatever our human-based goals. Then we understand our three-legged stool, our critters, wildlife, habitat, ecosystems, or our people, our human dimensions of our three-legged stool. And how do those fit in with our human-based goals? And then we want to make decisions aimed to achieve our goal. So there's decisions required for each leg. And no action is a possible decision, but if you decide on no action, you need to have a reason why you decide no action. It's okay to not do stuff, but it's okay to not do stuff if you've thought out the process and you've thought of different ideas and you decide that that was the best possible idea. But you really need to look at your goals, look at how it affects each leg of the stool, and then decide, what should I do that will best work for all three of these stools? Because you cut out one leg of the stool tips over. And that's what takes us to the end of this lecture. But there is a movie that I've attached. So once again, if you're watching with the PDF slides, you pause it right here and you click on this movie. This movie is fantastic for me. This movie is, when I think about it, I think about this is what a lot of places in the world could be like and should be like. And I'm hoping one day will be like, because it really is, it shows how a community has adapted to the natural resources around them, and they understand the value of the natural resources around them. They understand that they are a part of it, that they're just one piece of this ecosystem, but they also understand that they have human goals and they have children that they want to raise, and towns with tourism that they want to have, and they figured out the human goals they want. They figured out the ecology of the natural resources and the wildlife within their community, and they really found a way to live together and live in harmony. And it's a beautiful idea. It's a beautiful movie, and I'm hoping you guys enjoy it as much as I did. And so I'm hoping you enjoyed this class. I'm hoping you took a lot from it. And that's it.